Well, good afternoon and welcome to our conference on the future of government and the civil service. I appreciate you all participating, albeit in a virtual conference rather than in a real face-to-face conference. And hopefully after the middle of the year, we'll be able to turn to face-to-face meetings. But all the same, it's great to have you all with us. And we have an outstanding panel with us today. And I'm going to ask each member of the panel to say a few words, and then I'll ask the panel a couple of questions, and then we'll go over to audience questions to them, and the whole conference will last for about an hour, that sort of time, and we'll finish it after around an hour. So first of all, the key participants in the conference are, first of all, Josie Kluwer, who is a partner with EY in the government and public sector practice. She has great experience of the public sector and of the civil service, and is involved with helping with the training of civil servants as well nowadays. Secondly, we have Jill Rutter, also a former civil servant with HM Treasury, worked at Number 10 and with DEFRA, and she's a senior research fellow with UK and a Changing Europe at King's College London. And thirdly, Dame Patricia Hodgson, who is the former chair of Ofcom, spent many years working with the BBC, has worked in the civil service, and Patricia is the deputy chairman of the think tank Policy Exchange. So to all three of you, welcome, and it's great to have all three of you with us today for this conference. And what I'm going to do now is ask Josie if she would lead the way and say a few words, and then we'll move to Jill and then to Patricia. So Josie, over to you.
Brilliant, thanks Alexander. So I've been thinking about what advice I would give the government of the future, and I was thinking 2030, and two bits of advice came to mind. The first is, it's not just what you have, it's what you do with it that counts. And the second is, it's not all about you. So I'll spend a bit of time on each of those bits of advice. So the first is about, it's not just what you've got, it's what you do with it that counts. So it is clear that there are acute skills shortages in the civil service. And it's clear that we need more project managers and commercial folk, data scientists. And there's an important job of work to train people in those skills. But at the same time, those shortages are also acute across the wider economy. And actually, there's some evidence that suggests that people feel that their skills are not being utilised to the best effect. Nearly 40% of scientists suggest that across government. So it feels clear that we need to make best alignment of those skills to government priorities. And actually, if you combine that with the idea of thinking about the challenges of 2030, which much like today are really complex, they're multifaceted, they're tough to solve. The way that we will solve those challenges is by bringing together a multidisciplinary team with a range of skills and experience to solve them. And so that leads me towards thinking that the government of 2030 will have a much more flexible and a much more deliberate resourcing model, much more focused on challenges and much less focused on the silos of departments. And that would bring a sharper focus to knowing what skills we've got in the civil service, whether that's recorded in a skills passport or a skills wallet, being really clear about how one gets a stamp in your skills passport, what level of assurance or accreditation or license to practice one might have. Of course, there's a big job of training people to meet those standards. And then also being clear about how do we prioritise those skills against the priorities of government. So to my second bit of advice, which is really about, it's not just about you, it's not just about the civil service. One of the things I learned really quickly when I worked in government was that there's quite a lot more to affecting change in the country than just writing a press release. And so I think the challenge of 2030 is, how do we get the 500,000 civil servants to work really effectively with the 5 million public servants, to work really effectively with the wider actors who are part of making change happen in the country. And actually, if we think about, we were just talking about the vaccine rollout, and that has required cross-departmental officials to work together with local authorities, with GPs, with the wider health economy, with the private sector, with the third sector. And actually, in that endeavour, government plays a role of not as a deliverer or a commander, but as a convener or a facilitator or a catalyst or an activator for change. And I think that is the role of government in 2030. And there's some really interesting work going on across government in the Government Skills and Curriculum Unit, which released its strategy paper a few months ago. And in its title, it talks about knowledge, training, and networks. And I think the focus on networks is really important, because there's a real insight into the shift that we need to make to seeing the civil service as part of a delivery network and individual civil servants as delivering through their networks. And I guess just as we use the networks for government to make change happen, we also need to use the networks to pull on the outside world to make sure we've got all the information and expertise to inform policy. And so Michael Gove's speech at Sitchley is really compelling on the case for diversity in all its forms, and really compelling for the case for moving civil servants out of London. Because it just must be that better policy is made if people making the policy have a really good understanding of the lived experience of the lives of people whose lives and livelihoods are affected by policy. So I might suggest we go a bit further and expect civil servants to spend a couple of days a year shadowing people on the front line and people whose people whose lives are affected by government policy. So, for example, the DWP official who's writing policy on universal credit spends time in the job centre with work coaches down at the local citizens' advice, understanding what life is really like. And similarly, we need a real feed from academia to make sure that we get the best thinking, the best evidence, the best research, to bring that real rigour to underpin both policy making at the beginning of the process, but also another theme of Michael Gove, really making sure we're evaluating the impact of government policy. And I have a hunch that government in 2030 will be much more systematic about the way that it engages with academia and researchers. And so I'm probably out of time, Alexander, so I'll hand back to you. But they're my two bits of advice for the government of 2030. Not just about what you've got, but it's what you do with it that counts. And it's not all about the civil service.
Well, thanks very much, Josie, and I think everyone will agree that's useful and very important advice. And I'm glad you're talking about engagement between the public sector and academia, being us, the International School for Government, and given our very heavy engagement with the civil service, there's a great deal to be said for that. So, Jill, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Alexandra. And yeah, I think Josie is absolutely right. I think one of the really interesting challenges at the moment is for the government to actually do some critical thinking about what worked, not just in the civil service, but in the wider public service in the last 5 years around preparations, both for Brexit and the response to COVID, and look honestly at what didn't work and think about how do we build on the things that worked, make sure we don't lose those when we're not got the sort of immediate pressingness of other things, and look at what didn't work and think about how we learn to remedy those. And I think that's much better than just looking at civil service reform in a sort of vacuum. And actually it's about more than the civil service, it's about ministerial capabilities, think that matters a lot. And it's also about the relationships between central government, local government, other agents of the state, and indeed the citizens. So I think loads of things to think about there. I think what for me was really disappointing was much was made of Michael Gove's Ditchley lecture last summer, but actually, you can mention Gramsci in a lecture, but it doesn't make it deeply radical or very interesting. And actually, I thought what was disappointing about that was, while it had a slightly conventional diagnosis of what was wrong, and indeed, offered to build on some of the changes that have been made, more focused on project delivery. We've had the Infrastructure and Projects Authority that now has a more professional approach to project management. I think that is on the upward curve. It mentioned sort of building digital data commercial skills. Nobody's going to disagree with that, guys. That's pretty much there. It actually didn't have anything desperately interesting to say about most things that you might want to do as civil service reform. Indeed, the sort of bit everybody remembers, and really the only bit that the government seems to be notably taking forward, is this slightly sort of performative move to move civil servants out of London. You can do that. And indeed, we probably at 12:30 are about to hear a bit more of that from the Chancellor in the budget, when we discover, which town is the lucky winner of, the lottery to get Treasury Northern Economic Campus. But will it make bunches of difference? A bunch of middle-class people living in a northern town may not experience that much more diversity than a bunch of people. Remember, London has some of the highest levels of deprivation in the country, as well as everybody hangs out in the centre and goes to their local coffee shop. So I'm not sure that makes a huge difference. A lot of people would say actually devolving decision-making would make more difference than dispersing civil servants around the country. I think the real question for the government is this really its civil service reform agenda? Or does it have a different and slightly under-disclosed agenda? I think if you look at the real difference between ministerial civil service relations, dating back actually not to this government, not to David Cameron's government, but to the governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, has been a real sort of diminution of ministerial interest in civil service as principal policy advisors. And I think one of the things that we have seen in the last year with the Dominic Cummings hard rain language is not a replacement of civil servants with political appointees, but a much more difficult operating environment for civil servants who want to challenge ministers, either on policy or indeed on propriety. And this is my final thing, is there is a vacancy at the moment for the Director General of Propriety and Ethics. If you read the Mail on Sunday, you'll have seen a lot of hostile briefing about its previous occupant who's decided to take her talents, grown actually in the private sector, out of government off to the Premier League, having found government a bit of a hostile environment, I think, to operate in. Would you, in this government, want to be the civil servant charged with looking after propriety and ethics? I think that would be tantamount to writing a suicide note in this government. I wouldn't do it. And I think we need to think about whether we need a bit of a discussion about whether we actually have the right protections in place for the civil service, whether indeed we want to have a national debate about whether, rather than have a bit of covert attenuation of the impartial civil service through the back door, we'd actually rather have an explicit debate about whether we should do it through the front door.
Well, there's a thought. There's no doubt about it that within the government there's much discussion about the political perspectives of the civil service and the extent to which the government feels the civil service is sufficiently engaged with the public and the moods of the public. It's a very interesting debate. Patricia, you have been doing work, I know, for the think tank policy exchange on reforming the civil service. So over to you.
Thank you. Yes, we've got a commission on better government, which will report before too long. with cross-party membership, officials, consultants, some international help from your part of the world, Alexander. And what is extraordinary is the degree of consensus. But I'd just like to start by saying, isn't it curious how timely this is? Because government's usually about politics and high drama, you know, Brexit, the budget, Scottish independence, all things happening today in the political field. But suddenly, the plumbing of government, the machinery of government is up there too. Boris Johnson is reported to have said early in the pandemic that when he pulled the levers of government, nothing happened. Pandemic planning hadn't been funded or taken forward. We couldn't supply PPE or manage test and trace. Comparisons were drawn with South Korea, Singapore, or Taiwan, who managed things better. Was this because it's a more disciplined culture there were more government controls, or was there simply better government? Then, of course, in a uniquely British way, at the 11th hour, success began to trump failure. Our cheap and portable AstraZeneca vaccine is a genuine gift to the world. The rollout is a triumph. That and our genomic mapping capability makes us a global leader suddenly in managing COVID. So, as Jill said, we've learned the hard way about where we're doing well and where we aren't. And now we have to work on how those lessons can be baked into government for the 20th century. So what have we learned? And there's, I think, a fair amount of consensus already on the panel. We've learned that ministers must set clear directions. We've seen thematic cabinet committees supported by experts knocking ministerial heads together and leading interdepartmental working. The health secretary found that he couldn't set NHS priorities easily or direct Public Health England. So he announced legislation to give ministers more control of the NHS and brought Public Health England under departmental control. There will be big debates about this, as Jill said, but watch for more of this. Second, as I think we're all saying, officials need managerial, delivery, and technical skills. Some will be brought in from outside as needed, but they need to be built into career development. We know we need better interdepartmental working, that's always with us, as well as coordination or even devolution to local authorities and organisations. As Jill was saying, government's committed to moving key parts of government to regional hubs, interdepartmental groupings around the United Kingdom, aiming to get both policy and delivery closer to the public and investment working there where it's needed. Josie's catalyst point. Government teams in Whitehall also, just like those around the country, need to be flexible, as they have increasingly been, we've seen, bringing in business, technical, project management, even military skills on contract or secondment, and this must continue. But above all, senior officials need to be rewarded for better managerial and technical skills, and as I think both Josie and Jill were arguing, to be accountable for outcomes, not outputs. Senior officials in Singapore earn nearly commercial levels of pay. I think, Alexander, but you'd know best, that in Australia and New Zealand, with constitutional systems similar to our own, pay is certainly better than it is here. And thirdly, big data and its proper use at the heart of government. And we know that we've done terribly well over the last decade with the gov.uk website and services across government made available to the public in one place. Outstanding performance of our universal credit system, the furlough system, coping with the increase in demand in the early months of the pandemic. But also we saw departmental and agency systems failing to speak to one another and basic information not available to policymakers. Senior officials and politicians didn't grip automated systems, leading to an exam crisis in the schools last summer. The government's digital and data service is being restructured, and there's a long way to go. Functions scattered across government will have to work together or come together, and digital data is becoming key to decision-making. So officials and ministers will need to understand the basics. So why are these issues up there now, alongside budgets and Scottish independence and elections? Because ministers and officials have learned what they could and couldn't do. In my day-to-day activities, I talk to senior officials about their jobs in many departments, and they're proud of their successes. But they have also seen better ways of doing things and want the freedom and the training to work better. And because the population, people, are more aware than ever of whether or not government's working for them, unless we get this right, democracy really will be in danger.
Well, thank you very much, Patricia. I must say that brings a lot of thoughts to my mind as somebody, in my case, who was a minister for many years in the Australian government. So the first observation I'd like you to all comment on, focusing here on the UK, is that UK has had a series of huge issues to deal with over the last couple of years. There's obviously been Brexit, the negotiations at one level, the preparations for Brexit at another. There have been all the decisions that have had to be made in relation to COVID, and there are the budgetary problems that the government has to deal with, which relates to those big issues. And then there are many other issues like social care over and above that. To what extent, and we'll start with Josie, to what extent do we feel that the British civil service, the UK civil service during that period has performed well? And this is, I suppose, a bit of a political question, but we have to face to the politics being an important part of this discussion. To what extent does a good performance by a department depend on a minister or ministers with a clear sense of priorities and a clear sense of direction? And where that clear sense of priorities and direction is missing, does a department start to perform poorly? Or is the problem that within the departments, it just aren't the civil servants with the right skill set, and there isn't sufficient coordination between departments? So to what extent is the problem that there needs to be much better training, better recruitment policies, better interdepartmental mechanisms? Or is the bigger problem that sometimes you have very good, we won't mention any personalities here, but in some cases you have very good and clear ministerial direction, and in other cases not so much, and therefore departments become a bit lost. Josie, why don't we start with you? We'll go in the same order again.
Well, just kick off with the easy question then. I think there's a lot in that. And I think it's clear that strong performance comes from the top and strong ministerial direction is important. I do worry a bit about the tenor of the debate about civil service performance. Sometimes I worry that we ought to give government a break and give it a little bit of space to try new things and fail and improve and learn the lessons. Because, if you think about government through obviously the pandemic, but also, all of those things you were talking about, Alexander, they are really big, complex, multifaceted, tricky problems to solve. And I think there's something about how do we help government have the space, find the space to try new things, learn from mistakes, and then iterate and do something differently. I was always really taken by Frances Maud's idea of having an award for the idea that was the best idea but actually failed, and then somebody learnt from it, which I thought was wonderful, and I definitely I think that's important. But one of the things that I think is really interesting about this is that the public, I think, are ahead of the Westminster Village, as with so many things. So if you think about the pandemic, the Westminster Village has been sort of howling for government about U-turns, but actually the public are much less worried about that. They're much more worried about, have we got the right answer? Have we got the right policies in place? And so I think there's something about helping set a culture, both inside and outside government, of saying we've got to be able to learn from mistakes. We've got to be able to try new things. And performance is good performance. Part of good performance is about how we do that and how we test and learn.
For ministers, if they're trying new things, being bold in that way, they have to put up with a huge amount of media objection, criticism, debate. The opposition, understandably being the opposition, will focus on anything that fails or might fail. And so ministers can be unduly conservative, I suppose, in that environment. Jill.
I'm going to focus on Brexit because I've done lots of work at the Institute for Government Brexit, and indeed on the UK and Changing Europe website, you can find a long read that I did a couple of weeks ago about the civil service and Brexit. So I think I would report that the civil service's performance on Brexit is mixed. I think the civil service actually portrayed its lack of real understanding of both the EU and a lack of appreciation of the devolved settlements and the difficulties there. And in particularly, I think there was a lack of understanding in Whitehall of the situation in Northern Ireland, all of which contributed to making Brexit harder. It was undoubtedly unprepared. That was partly David Cameron's explicit refusal to let the civil service think much about what would happen if the referendum went wrong in advance. Interesting interview we've got on our Brexit Witness archive with Philip Rycroft, who was one of the sort of permanent secretary at the Department for Exiting the EU. So do recommend those. But I think if you look at Brexit, you will also see the problems for the civil service in two fronts. One of which was solved to an extent by the advent of Boris Johnson, was the May government just could not decide what it wants. If you have a hopelessly split cabinet, that is a horrendous position for the civil service. The civil service wants to advise, but ultimately wants ministers who will take a decision, and ministers who will basically hang around like a bunch of rabbits in front of the headlights of an oncoming car are a terrible disaster for the civil service. The civil service then expands to fill that vacuum. It then gets massive amounts of grief. And that's a terrible, terrible, terrible position for the civil service to be in. Second thing is the civil service being asked to invent systems at pace that had not been needed for 40 plus years. And I don't think they were helped by a bunch of denialism from ministers. And this, I think, is a problem of the Johnson government rather than the May government, about how difficult some of those things would be. And a refusal by ministers. If you listen to Boris Johnson's announcement of his deal with the EU, in which he said there are no new non-tariff barriers to trade with the EU, to which the only answer is pantomime sort of, oh yes, there are, look at them, they're coming from you. If you have ministers who say it's a Remainerish plot to point out that if you move to a more distant relationship with a large integrated trading, from a large integrated trading arrangement to a Canada-style arrangement, there will be frictions, then you are not creating a very good environment to be working in. And I think there was a lot of willful denialism by ministers, which made talking to business very difficult and made the civil services job much harder. And actually, I think you can say there are lots of problems, but you can also say it is almost amazing that things have not fallen over more than they have. So I think it's very much a sort of balanced verdict on Brexit. I think some of that, one of the interesting things is a lot of people in the civil service say doing those dry runs, not least for no deal Brexit, were actually quite helpful when it came to thinking about how they'd need to work differently and put them in a better place to deal with some aspects of the pandemic. Some of those things have undoubtedly been problems. Others, frankly, ministers just don't know what they're talking about. Matt Hancock says he needs to be able to give instruction to Public Health England. Public Health England is an agency of the Department of Health. Matt Hancock could always give instructions to Public Health England if he wanted. So I don't know why he thinks he needs to move the deck chairs around mid-pandemic in order to do that. He could always actually set a different mandate for the NHS. So an awful lot of the solutions he's coming up with seem to be solving problems that didn't really exist. And actually, I think a really bad time to be doing things. But that's a different sort of set of issues. Undoubtedly, there were big shortcomings in the response. But a lot of the shortcomings, I think, were actually in ministerial decision-making. And I think that's very much what we saw in the Department for Education, not so much among the officials, but in some cases, I think ministers' willingness to dump the blame on officials has been genuinely unedifying.
Yes, well, that is always a risk, and can happen. Patricia.
Well, I'm going to agree with a lot that's been said. Clear sense of direction can only come from a government with an agenda that it can manage to get agreed in cabinet. It then, of course, needs a partnership between the minister in a particular department and the Perm Sec to deliver. So that's about individuals, personalities. And I think the very good point that Josie made about the space to pilot and iterate and how hard that is in a political environment that is quite often poisoned by social media and pressure. There are also functional problems, too many levels in the senior civil service, too much competition between teams and departments, and even within departments. The number, I mean, digital is now my career place to go to. There are literally hundreds, I mean, I'm talking about more than 500 officials in different departments competing to supply the government's digital agenda. This is nonsense. I mean, I know the Cabinet Office is now going to get a grip on that, but there is too much of that. And some of the best talent and the most successful officials that I've talked to during the pandemic are really frustrated by the problem that they have had, either getting data from other departments or getting their submissions up through the system. And I think that that is one of the things we've learned from the last year. We have to streamline.
Very quickly, and then we'll move to the broader questions from the audience. But very quickly, is the criticism that the civil service in the UK is too disconnected from the public, has insufficient empathy and understanding of the moods and attitudes of the public? Is that a genuine problem? In other words, the sense that the civil service has its own kind of ideology, and that might be very much an ideology that reflects what particular demographics in London think, as distinct from what the average punter out in Voterland thinks. It is often said that is a problem, and I can say in Australia that's probably writ a little larger because the capital is Canberra, which is by hundreds of kilometres and in many cases thousands of kilometres isolated from the broader community. You often get that criticism there as well. So Josie, what do you think?
So I think the perception is almost as important as whether the reality is true. So I think it is the case that there is a perception out there in the British public that the elites, the centre, the government, whoever they are disconnected from their lives and understanding of the lived experience of most, them and people like them. And I think we have seen the expression of that in various, electoral things, including Brexit, but also including a whole bunch of other stuff. And that is damaging in itself. I then think the question, well, is that true? Well, I think if you take a look at the makeup of the civil service, it is still more white, more posh, more London or more Southern, more Remain than the country at large. The question then is, does that matter? So I think it matters, yes, because of the perception, but I also think there is a challenge then to maintain independence and impartiality, and to back to the point I was making earlier, really make sure that there is a sufficient understanding of the lives and livelihoods of those people who are affected by government policy, and it feels like there is a tilt that could be made towards understanding them better.
Jill?
I think there is undoubtedly a thing that the policy jobs in the civil service, and it's very much the policy jobs. The civil service is not predominantly based in London. The civil service is, quite widely spread throughout the country, but the policy jobs are monopolised by London. I don't think the people actually come from London, but they do sort of tend to come from wherever you live to a good university, and then into London. Actually, the civil service is a much less elite recruiter from universities than a lot of law firms, consultancies, and other places that people look to, which tend to sort of basically say, if you're not from a Russell Group university, we probably won't look at you. So I think the civil service actually does draw on wider views. I think the civil service was undoubtedly, but along with most of the political elite, taken aback by the Brexit result. And in that sense, it was undoubtedly not reading the national mood. I think one of the Cameron government's worst decisions was to dispense with a thing called the Government Office Network, which is different from this sort of proposal we have now to disperse departments, which actually had sort of, bits of government sitting in regions, and people there were charged with making sure that those regional perspectives were fed into government decision making. And I actually thought that was genuinely really helpful, and a big mistake to do that. I sometimes wonder if they'd have misread the national mood on Brexit so badly if they'd had people from the northeast, from Yorkshire, from the southwest turning up regularly, bringing in those views. So I think that is a bit of a problem. The place of the civil service, as with a lot of things struggled, is less on women. It's done quite well on women. It's not the profession of choice for a lot of BAME people. That's a bit of a shame. It needs to do better on that, but is on social mobility. There have been actions to try and do things on that. That's a more general problem, I think, of the sort of feeder in from the educational system up there. Civil service has done quite well in embracing things like apprenticeships, and people talk very highly of the apprentices they're getting in. So it is aware of the problem and the need to do things about it. But I do think there is a sort of more general problem that the civil service, is a symptom of rather than a cause of, which is the London centricity of the UK in general. You mentioned Australia. The thing is, I have lots of friends who work for the government in New South Wales. Why do they all go and work for a state government? Because they want to live in Sydney, not in Canberra. So there is a sort of dispersion effect in other places. In Germany, you can have loads of good jobs in places that are not Berlin. In the UK, you're too often confronted with the only place you can really do that great high-paying job is London, and that goes for the media, got a bit of dispersion out to Manchester now, it goes to the media, it goes to the civil service, it goes to business, lots of the sort of, consultancy, banking and things like that. And I think that's a more general UK problem that just dispersing a bunch of civil servants around the countryside will not resolve.
And Patricia?
Obviously, London centricity is a UK problem widely, and in addition to that, all big organisations self-generate a culture, don't they, that becomes self-reinforcing. So there is bound to be a problem that isn't about blame. I mean, it's just something you've got to fight against all the time. So we've heard a couple of good ideas about shadowing, making sure that parts of careers really involve going and working in the front line or sitting alongside the front line. I think and of course, bringing in leaders, as Jill was saying, from around the country. The Home Office is doing that quite well at the moment, I think, with police chiefs from around the country. But also, I think the civil service probably got to learn to consult better. It's got into a trap whereby big consultations on huge issues consist of 150 pages of paper, or, you know, difficult to read on your PC, which is actually only going to be engaged with by pressure groups and or the regulatory departments of big organizations. So I think something that we all need to start thinking about is, how does it consult better? How does it use all the frontline public services as well as digital technology to really hear what people are thinking?
Well, we'll just move to the audience questions. We've got 20 minutes left, and we won't be able to get through them all because, Rebecca, I can see we've got 22 questions there, and a few that have been sent in advance. So this does bring together a couple of questions, one from Sally King and another from Lewis Coiffé. And Sally's question is, I'd like to know more about the role of external bodies such as think tanks, lobby groups, and specialist research consultancies in influencing civil service practice and or government policies. Will a shrinking civil service, well, I'm not sure if it's shrinking anymore, mean a growth in external, possibly corporate funded research organizations influencing the social research and policy agenda? So we'll go through you all again, and just be brief with your answers because we've got a lot of questions. So Josie.
So the most important point here is that government does not have the monopoly on great ideas or great understanding of what's going on in the country, and that actually, if we want to make good policy, we have got to make sure we are getting input from all of those who understand what's going on. And in particular, I said it earlier, but I'll reiterate the importance of getting evidence, academic research from those brilliant institutions like your own, actually, Alexander, to inform policy.
Jill?
So I think one of the real problems is the lack of knowledge and the lack of valuing of knowledge in the civil service. We talk a lot about skills, but actually what you often find is the real knowledge lies outside the civil service, whether it's in academia or it's in think tanks. And the problem in both academia and think tanks is they can have quite good subject specific knowledge and policy knowledge. They're very weak on actually how to make things happen knowledge. And it always surprises me that the civil service fails to make a compelling offer to ministers. If you have your legal expert, the legal expert will say, well, actually, Minister, you'd be very unwise to do this because these are the legal implications of this, and you'll probably go down. Debates about whether ministers always take that. But the civil service should, I think, position itself as the people who know how to make things happen in various areas and really understand those delivery systems, and don't seem to me to be positioned to be able to do that. And the real danger of politicians just picking up bright ideas from think tanks is they sound good on paper, but they don't work in practice.
Well, Patricia, that's a good segue into you.
Well, I can't really add to that. All those things are absolutely right. And the most important thing is that we get a real free public debate in which particular ideas are not vetoed as somehow unacceptable. We really have to have open debate if we're going to have good government.
We've got a question from Lieutenant General Leakey, who's the former Black Rod, and he asks, what are or should be the fundamental and defining roles of civil servants? That's a big question. And to what extent or which of these roles can or should be undertaken by non-career civil servants? So go through Josie again.
So you've got me on the hop, but I'm not sure that there are any roles in the civil service that would have to be done by a career civil servant. And actually, I think there's a really important debate about how, you know, if we care about diversity in the broadest sense of the term, and we care about bringing in ideas from elsewhere in from all sectors, then why wouldn't we champion and encourage and welcome folk with experience from the public, you know, the wider public sector, the private sector, the third sector, to come and bring their skills and knowledge, which I totally agree with Jill, to bear on government. So somebody's probably going to come up with a really good example of a role that has to be done by a career civil servant. But actually, I think, you know, if to go back to what I was saying earlier, if we think about how do we get the best ideas, the best delivery mechanisms to make change happen, actually, we should be really open to talent in all its forms, however we can use it inside government and out.
Yeah, to come in there, I think there's a really interesting question. Oh, sorry.
Well, we're talking about, to an extent, aren't we, really career movement between the public and the private sector. And I think that is becoming both inevitable as work patterns have changed in the 21st century, but also necessary because of the range of skills needed. But at the same time, building and retaining knowledge within the civil service, which is about training and reward and some experience outside. Now, we're not going to get the right balance and the right flexibilities unless we look at the reward structure, because there's a great deal of evidence about the way civil service pay has fallen behind pay, not at all levels, but in some really important areas like professional areas, skills areas at the top of the civil service. And unless we do something about that, and the civil service, the main reward for being in the civil service is can you sit it out till your final salary pension scheme, we are just not going to manage that balance of skills as well as we should.
Somebody called Colin Talbot has made an interesting point here. It's worth pointing out the big shift of the civil service away from London and the southeast that took place in the 1970s to 2000 period, down from 46% to 30%. Since 2000, it's stabilized around the latter figure. This information reflects quite a few questions which are asked about the virtue in public administration of devolution. And one or two of you in your presentations have mentioned this question of moving civil servants out of London. But I wonder if you could reflect on this, because quite a few people have asked questions about it. Does that really make a lot of sense, moving? My civil servants, we're really talking here more about policy professionals, I suppose, rather than administrative roles, because one of you made the point that there are a lot of civil servants outside of London, but the policy professionals tend to be concentrated in London. It's this idea of, you know, moving the Treasury to Darlington, or was it Darlington? Or it's part of it to Darlington. I mean, do these kind of ideas make any sense? Are they really going to make any difference to public administration? So
I come in on that. I mean, do they make a big difference? Well, one question is it really going to be sustained? I used to work in DEFRA. You mentioned that, Alexander. DEFRA moved one division to Bristol, was going to create an environmental sort of hub campus there. We've got the Environment Agency there and things like that, but ended up not moving anything else there, which meant people were then confronted with the choice of, did they just stick doing the wildlife and countryside job, which was the division that moved, and their lifestyle in Bristol, because remember, it's much easier on a civil service salary to have a better lifestyle very often outside London than inside, or did they move back for career reasons? And that's not a terribly satisfactory way of doing things. So if it's just a bunch of people on trains coming down to see their ministers face to face, then it doesn't make much difference. If it's something genuine and things like that, maybe it'll make a bit of difference. but I think a really interesting thing is if you have more big decisions being made in different places, then actually you grow a talent pool. I mean, it's quite interesting. I thought Australia, and maybe this was just spin by, I think, Terry Moran, who was one of your senior civil servants, came to London,
Yeah.
had an event.
The head of the Prime Minister's department.
Yeah, head of the Prime Minister's department. He said actually Australia did this thing much more systematic to bring people in. You've obviously got people who've been in state governments performing functions who are an available recruitment pool to bring into your centre. We sometimes use local government to get people with delivery experience because people do. And actually the salaries for running, Little Bigshire District Council are much bigger very often than they are for being permanent secretary of a big UK government department, rather bizarrely. And you can go and pick up redundancy quite often as well in local government. But I think it's really interesting. If you grow some of those roles, how do we then bring people in to central government? And we do that really badly. At this event with Terry Moran, I was very struck by Gus O'Donnell, our former cabinet secretary, saying, well, we've tried bringing in people from outside, it never works. You think, yeah, Gus, that's because you throw people in, give them no support, and then go, yeah, you failed. Whereas what Terry Moran claimed the Australians did, being very nervous here because you'll know whether this is real or not, or just some Antipodean spin, which we get quite a bit up here. What Terry Moran claimed people did was that you actually brought people in at a slightly lower level with a view of actually, helping them into being effective in a new environment, but with a view that they would then be able to move on to more senior roles. And it strikes me that if you want to do successful ins and outs, you actually need to have a much more strategic and planning approach than we have. I think there's also a question of, do you recruit people because they come with some views on what they want to achieve in that job? Or do we insist that people come as a sort of completely viewless vessel into which a minister will then do that? And that might mean they then don't want to work for the next minister who comes along that they just don't feel so sympathetic to and not so keen on. And I think it's not quite politicization, but it's a sort of thing with, do we come in and I've been appointed to do this job because I have a view of actually what making a difference to this will become. We use SARS like that, but we're very uncomfortable about using civil servants like that.
Patricia or Josie, do you want to add to that? I
think what Jill just said is great wisdom. If we could develop careers between local government and decentralized central government, so that we actually bring in talent with a wider range of experience. And then, of course, as you say, Jill, look after them. And I think the speed of modern government is such that you probably do need to want to do something. And if the rewards are right, then it's not a disaster. It shouldn't be a disaster if you then go and do a different job after a period. But those sorts of issues are very different from devolution. And the devolution agenda is a huge one and very, very difficult because we've had a centralized political culture in this country for hundreds of years. And our voting districts are such that you would, as we've seen in some places, you get local governments that don't change their colour, and then you get a lot of problems. And also you get rich areas and poor areas, and so your funding system is very difficult. You can't link taxation to representation locally. It's such a huge subject, and I hope we'll look at the decentralisation agenda and central government working better across the UK separately from real devolution.
Two quick thoughts to add to that.
Josie?
Just two quick thoughts. So one on Jill's question about, can we sustain senior policy officials, because that's actually who he's talking about, being out in different regions, not in London. I think there's a big question about ministers. What will ministers demand? So if ministers are in London because they have to vote in London and they are demanding policy officials brief them face to face, then this will not work. But the pandemic has taught us that actually we can do quite a lot of business like this over video. And isn't there a wonderful opportunity to think not just about how do we do the business of government, but also how do we do the business of politics, and how do we do the kind of parliamentary side of that. And then separate point about levelling up and how moving parts of government can act as a catalyst for investment, economic growth, and the whole levelling up agenda.
We have a question here from Melanie Field. I reckon this is a very interesting question. One I would love to talk about at some length myself, but I'm going to throw it to the panel. Any thoughts from the panel on the role of special advisors and their impact on the ability of civil servants to provide the best possible advice and to speak truth to power? It's an old one, that's speaking truth to power. Coming from Australia, people love to speak truth to power here. They don't seem to die in doing it. But anyway, special advisors, that's quite an issue. Well, Josie.
So I ought to start, having been a special advisor myself back during Gordon Brown's government. My view on SPADs is that if they didn't exist, we would have to invent them. So there is a crucial role of helping ministers translate their political priorities into government priorities and making the system work. And that role oils the wheels of government. And as I say, if it wasn't for special advisors, you would have to create them. And I think they do a great job of navigating the complex and important kind of tension, creative tension between ministers and civil servants, which is part of our parliamentary democracy and part of how our government system works. And sometimes that balance comes unstuck one way or the other, and sometimes that's because of the politics, and sometimes that's because of personalities. And so I think special advisors really important, and how do we put the checks and balances in place to make sure that their role is about supporting that creative tension and maintaining it as creative rather than destructive.
Patricia.
I think Josie's absolutely I think Josie's absolutely right, although I've also no doubt that there are many SPADs who are not as good as she was and who become grit in the wheels. And of course, the problem is, who does the minister appoint, and what does the minister expect the SPAD to do? A PermSec friend of mine, recently retired PermSec friend of mine, did some very good work thinking about strengthened ministerial offices, by which she didn't mean politicized ministerial offices, although there might be SPADs in there. She meant a small number of experts who would expect to serve possibly across more than one minister, although not forever, and would understand that if they didn't get on with a minister, they would move on. But she decided that what she thought was roughly 8 to 10 roles that would really help and enable a minister to do their job, of course, appointed in collaboration with the PermSec and agreed with the PermSec. Now, I've no idea whether that would work, but I thought it was an interesting idea.
It's not,
Jill.
I mean, it's not been not done. When I was at DEFRA, we used to have, political SPADs, SPAD who'd look after the media, but we also had what we call specialist advisors, and who actually helped the Secretary of State develop their agenda. The thing, and I think that was very helpful. They were good to work with and stuff like that. And generally, good SPADs who know how to work with the civil service are incredibly helpful, because they can give you steers, things like that. Where I think they're bad is if they act as a sort of Praetorian guard around the minister. I remember being appalled going to a seminar in Canada with a bunch of civil servants and former advisors in the Canadian government, former ministers even in the Canadian government. And they were talking about, well, if the department got an appointment to see its minister, and the idea that, the interaction between the permanent civil service and a minister came in an incredibly formalized setting where, not very often with the permanent secretary there, rather than the sort of, much more fluid relations we have of going around the minister's office, maybe the SPAD being in the meeting, maybe not, depending on what it was about and things like that. My reaction there was, well, frankly, I'm very grateful for not being a civil servant in Canada. It sounds absolutely dire environment to work in. And I think a lot of ministers underestimate the importance for the civil service of having a bit of access to them. They say, why are all these civil servants sitting around in a meeting? Well, frankly, Minister, it's because they are going to go and represent your views in other departmental meetings, and they need to get a bit of insight into what you're thinking, what you're understanding, and how you work. And if you insist that you're always just going to keep them at arm's length, because honestly, you can't be bothered to have a couple more people sitting in on your meetings and you think they're wasting their time, then actually you are hobbling the capacity quite badly in that department. And I think the best ministers really understand that. Of course, the ministers who are worst at doing that are the really insecure ones. Naming no names, but that was how the Treasury utterly misjudged Gordon Brown when he became Chancellor. We thought he was going to be a big, intellectually secure Chancellor like Nigel Lawson, because that was his reputation. And he turned out to be someone who was too scared to make a decision in public or whatever, because he had to wait till he went off with his coterie of advisors and do it all in private behind closed doors. One of the great things about Rishi Sunak's promotional video was at least it gave the suggestion that sort of big meetings with lots of people in it are back in the Treasury. So well done, Rishi, if that's true.
Well, Rebecca, I think our hour is well and truly up. We've gone a little bit over time, but I want to do two things at the end. First of all, I do very sincerely want to thank Dame Patricia Hodgson, Jill Rutter and Josie Kluwer for what I can only describe as a magnificent performance, extremely interesting insights into the civil service, reform of the civil service, and you've given everybody, I'm sure, on this call, on this virtual conference, a great deal to think about. The second thing is that as the executive chair of the International School for Government at King's, I can't let this opportunity pass without a little bit of an advertisement for those of you who are really interested in taking these issues much further. And that is that later this year in September, when all the lockdown will be finished and everybody will be vaccinated and we'll have face-to-face meetings again, and that's what we're advised will happen. We have an executive training program called Drivers and Impediments to Reforming the UK Public Service, which is just 3 days, but 3 days of face-to-face teaching on UK public administration, the reform of UK public administration, climate change and sustainability, human resources challenges, and global Britain, governance in uncertainty. So if you're interested in participating in that course and doing that 3-day executive course, do get in touch with us at King's, and we'll be very happy to sign you up, because that's where these issues will be explored, not just unfortunately in the 1 hour, but they'll be explored over a long period of time. But again, thank you to the panel very much for your great insights. To the audience, I'm sorry we haven't been able to get through all of your questions, but I've scrolled through the questions and I think we've covered not all, but many of the themes in those questions, and it's been great to have all of you with us as well. So thank you all very much.